on to the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker Series. Today we present Not an Alternative founder Beka Economopoulos. I want to thank our partners for their support of today's program, the University of Michigan Museum of Natural History. Yeah, a great institution. The Museum Studies Program and Michigan Radio 91.7 FM. The talk today is actually a part of the Museums and Social Justice Lecture Series, which is being presented by the Museum Studies Program this fall. So a special welcome to all of you who are here today as its patrons. The Museums and Social Justice Series continues with a number of events still to come this fall, and there are printed flyers on the table in the outer lobby with more details about all that. Social justice and transparency find a renewed urgency in today's political climate, and a new generation of activists are working to make change by expanding the relevance, impact, and value of museums in today's world. From grassroots activists to professional organizations and foundations, museums are being pushed to both look inward and outward, to examine and transform themselves to be more inclusive and impactful institutions. Innovative museums are creating new models of exhibition development evaluation, and engaged museum leaders are asking museums to more fully commit to their potential to serve as open spaces for people to gather for discussion and debate of difficult topics. And it just so happens that right here in Ann Arbor, we have just such an institutional transformation at hand with the much beloved University of Michigan Museum of Natural History, which is preparing to move into a brand new space in the new Biological Science Building, which is now under construction right next to the current museum building. You probably can't miss it if you're in that area. You see two huge cranes overhead. The current museum will remain open until summer 2018, and the new museum will open in 2019. With all new exhibits, but showcasing your favorites, dinosaurs and specimens, in new ways and with the latest scientific information. The new museum has many new exciting components. It's truly innovative and future forward-looking and visionary, and much to be excited about there. Hopefully we can have some Penny Stamps events there. In their new digital dome theater that's going to be on top. In the meantime, you should go and visit the current museum, where coming soon is a much anticipated display is about to open. Many of you will recall just a year ago in October, there was a mammoth, the remains of a mammoth found just down the road on a farm just outside of Chelsea. And after lots of public discussion and a successful crowdfunding campaign, on November the 5th, you will be able to not only see this mammoth on display, but you will be able to touch it and touch a real mammoth bone. So that is not to be missed. So visit the current museum, and if you haven't ever been there, you must see the current rendition to be amazed by the new innovation that will be there in 2019. And if you're casting about for something culturally significant to do this evening, Stamps professor David Chung is presenting Sun Mi Yu's one-hour documentary film, Songs from the North, about North Korea in the screening room today at 7:30, directly following the Q&A, and this is free and open to all. Please remember to turn off your cell phones. We will have a regular Q&A in the screening room directly following, so exit the doors here, go left, down the hall, and you'll find yourself in the screening room, or in the lobby of the screening room. And now, for a proper introduction of our guests today, please welcome one of the most hardworking, humble, and truly engaged people I know, the director of the University of Michigan Museum of Natural History, Amy Harris.
Good afternoon, everyone. Last year, I had the good fortune to attend a really cool science museum conference in Montreal. And during a break, I went to explore the expo hall. And I looked at lots of booths, and I saw where they had inflatable planetariums for sale, and I saw the traveling exhibits that I could bring to my museum, and I saw a lot of exhibit designers who wanted my business. But then I came to a booth for the Natural History Museum. And being a Natural History Museum director, I immediately thought, hey, who are these people who think they have the Natural History Museum? And I'm pretty familiar with American and Canadian natural history museums, and we have some pretty spectacular and really big ones, but none of them call themselves the Natural History Museum. So I thought, oh well, it must be the people from London. But I was wrong. As I looked around the booth at the classic natural history, graphic design, and colors, and at the buttons they were giving away that said, affirming the truth of science, and kick Coke off the board, I knew I had stumbled onto something completely different. As I talked to the people in the booth, I became more and more fascinated. I learned that the Natural History Museum was a project launched by an artists collective, activists who wanted to challenge museum leaders and professionals and the public to take a closer look at the funding museums receive and from whom, and who they have on their boards, and how those commitments affect their messages and their missions. Museums are among the most trusted institutions in our society, but is this always well-deserved? Not an Alternative is a New York-based collective that works at the intersection of art, activism, and critical theory. The group has a mission to affect popular understandings of histories, symbols, and institutions through the occupation and redevelopment of popular vernacular, semiotics, and memes. Not an Alternative's latest ongoing project is the Natural History Museum, a mobile and pop-up museum that highlights the socio-political forces that shape nature, yet are often excluded from traditional natural history museums. The mission of the Natural History Museum is to affirm the truth of science. The museum inquires into what we see, how we see, and what remains excluded from our seeing. Not an Alternative was named in the New York Times and ArtNet's Best of Art in 2015 roundups. The group's installations, performances, and presentations have been featured within art institutions such as the Guggenheim in New York, MoMA PS1, Queens Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, the Tate Modern, Victoria and Albert Museum, MoCAD in Detroit, the Museo dell'Arte Moderno in Mexico City. They also work in the public sphere, where they collaborate with community groups and activist mobilizations. Today, we have the opportunity to learn more about Not an Alternative's work from one of its co-founders, Beka Economopoulos, who is also the founding director of the Natural History Museum. Beka has 2 decades of experience working within the advocacy and sustainability sectors as the director of online organizing at Greenpeace and the director of strategy at Fission Strategy, where clients included the United Nations Foundation, Global Climate Change Alliance, and others. Beka is originally from the DC area and is a graduate of Northwestern University. She currently resides in Brooklyn. Please join me in welcoming Beka Economopoulos to Ann Arbor.
Thanks, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here and want to thank Amy and Christina and Carla for bringing me here. I'm going to tell you a lot about the Natural History Museum today, but I want to start by giving you a bit of context around our artistic practice as Not an Alternative. So I'm going to talk about our journey and our aims. Not an Alternative, as Amy introduced, works at the intersection of art, activism, and critical theory. I won't repeat what she said, but I'll let you know that we are a collective formed in 2003 that is comprised of people from very different backgrounds. And depending on who you talk to or who's talking about our work, you're going to get a different take on it. My background is in activism and organizing, so I tend to speak about our work using that vocabulary. We also have a political and media theorist, art historian, cultural geographer, exhibit designer, originally from the American Museum of Natural History, now at another institution. So we were very interested in a multidisciplinary approach that cross-pollinates our worlds. And the name Not an Alternative derived from originally a Margaret Thatcher quote, where she said, "There is no alternative to capitalism." And we were interested in that no alternative as a sort of positively constituted thing. So we understand every symbol, every institution, every subjectivity to be fundamentally split, defined as much by its positive attributes as by that which it excludes or what is missing. In a time of what theorist Slavoj Žižek calls the decline of symbolic efficiency, in an age of hyper-fragmentation in the media ecosystem, meaning is contested, and it becomes harder to produce meaning collectively. So our practice is based not on the production of new subjectivities or symbols, but rather the excavation and occupation of existing ones. For many years, we had in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, an event space. During the day, it was New York City's very first co-working space. We had a couple of people living in the back. At night, we do artist talks and film screenings and workshops and panel discussions. And then all of this oriented around unpacking pressing contemporary issues. And with our production studio, we would put ideas that we would interrogate there into practice through experiments with community groups and activist mobilizations and social movements. So for many years, our practice intervened on spatial politics. You know, we're in North Brooklyn and the Williamsburg Greenpoint area at a time when New York City was facing its most aggressive rezoning, an estimated 40,000 new people in less than a decade. Gentrification is a huge topic in New York City, a wholesale transformation of the landscape. And we thought about what is our role as the creative class with a space within that landscape. You know, is it possible, rather than ducking our heads in the sand as the quote-unquote gentrifucker, right? Can we flip the script? Do we have agency there to put development and the tools of development in the hands of people? This was a collaboration with Picture the Homeless, a homeless-founded and homeless-led organization based in the South Bronx that we worked with for many years. My partner, who's an artist, co-founder of this, comes from an institutional critique background. He went to the Whitney program, where the artists were very influenced by folks like Hans Haacke and Andrea Fraser and Fred Wilson, who use, as artists, the vocabulary of the institution they're intervening upon to explore the gap between the ideals and the practice, to rearrange collections to reveal inherent power dynamics or the politics of the institution. In this case, our work had a lot to do with leveraging the tools of institutional critique and its methodologies, but applying them not to an art or a museum context, but rather to physical space. So leveraging and occupying the symbols that structure or govern our use of space. We're not against development, we're for development, but development that includes and is driven by the communities that will be impacted by it. So again, looking at symbols, we are very involved in the Occupy movement, producing work anonymously for a couple of years. In this case, this is the 1-year anniversary of the eviction of the encampment at Zuccotti Park. And we saw all of these police blocks, these concrete blocks that were preventing people from entering this space. It's sort of this dividing line between Wall Street and the north of the city. And we wondered who's protecting whom from whom, right? And so that was our intervention. These are made of foam. Destabilizing symbols, understanding that their meaning is not fixed. It's contested and split. When Hurricane Sandy happened, We created wayfinding signs, again, that use the symbols of road signs and construction and development and so on, and put them up in broad daylight so that people without power could find relief centers and know exactly where to go and what support they would be offered. Our occupied real estate project worked again with homeless-led organizations in the city, realizing that the housing bubble and the ensuing economic crash made manifest most visibly as the foreclosure crisis and homelessness. Took a look at how vacant properties in New York, they conducted a survey that showed that there were more vacant properties in Manhattan alone than the entire homeless population of all 5 boroughs of New York City. So it's a question not of space, but of political will. So wanting to bring attention to these spaces, Picture the Homeless and Occupy Homes moved homeless families into these empty foreclosures. And we sought to bring visibility to the work that they were doing and to develop a sort of collaboratively produced open source visual language that could function as connective tissue, knitting together different constituencies, different issues, different places around the country, and connecting Occupy Sandy and Occupy Homes to reveal the interrelatedness of disaster response and how it was playing out within the context of foreclosures and climate change. The symbol of the tent in the encampment after it was evicted, partnering with faith-based organizations. You cannot evict an idea whose time has come. And realizing that the movement did not have to die without the encampment, it could travel to communities, to foreclosed homes, to banks. That's the tent with sticky feet there. And then to the Department of Justice in a mobilization with hundreds of people and 75 foreclosed families from across the country, taking their message directly to the lawn in front of the DOJ. And doing that work not just out in physical space, but inside institutions as well. This is at the Tate Modern, at a show that was the backdrop for the unauthorized launch of Liberate Tate, which is an artist collective that lasted for about 6 years, and right after the BP Horizon oil spill in the Gulf, they sought to draw attention to and challenge BP's sponsorship of the arts and of the Tate Modern. And so they performed their first unauthorized action art performance intervention inside the Tate, using, again, the vocabulary of the institution they were intervening upon. Oil paint, Malevich's Black Square became a part of their performance as it was on display inside an exhibit in the museum. Very smart interventions over the course of many years that ultimately were successful. The Tate and BP parted ways earlier this year. So we saw how they were repurposing institutional critique that in this day and age had been criticized by many for losing its teeth, for not being effective in creating institutional change because it's so easily absorbed by the institution. So this felt like a sort of new wave of institutional critique that was not so easily absorbed because it was married to active pressure campaigns and social movements from the outside. At that time, we were doing a lot of fee-for-service work as a collective, getting hired by labor unions and NGOs and community groups to produce videos and props and performances and pop-up exhibits and mediagenic spectacle. One of them approached us wanting to do a campaign oriented around David Koch of the Koch brothers. He's New York City's wealthiest person, and he is a climate denier and a top funder of climate science disinformation campaigns. to the tune of $79 million over the last couple of decades. We decided not to take that contract, but learned in the course of researching it that Koch sat on the board of New York's American Museum of Natural History, a venerable institution that's been around for more than 100 years, that's celebrated, that's so influential. It sets the tone for other institutions. And we saw there contradiction between the ideals of the institution and the leadership on its board. So the Natural History Museum started out as a campaign and an effort to iterate upon the practice of Liberate Tate and other artist collectives that were forming around this demand for fossil-free culture in the context of climate change. So on the one hand, we aim to extend the fossil fuel divestment movement into the cultural sphere and challenge fossil fuel industry greenwashing in museums that communicate science to the public. On the other hand, we sought to borrow the vocabulary of natural history museums to tell a sort of people's history of natural history, amplifying key narratives that we thought were missing from other institutions. We have a mission to affirm the truth of science by highlighting the social, political, and cultural forces that shape nature but are excluded from traditional museums. So in many ways, we're performing as museum anthropologists and inviting visitors to do the same, attuned to the forces that are affecting both the atmospheric climate on Earth as well as the political, curatorial, programmatic, operational climate within natural history museums. So in this way, we're concerned with the genealogy of patronage and its implications for collections. What is collected? How is it collected? What is not? We're interested in what museum anthropologist Wayne Modest described to me as the absent archive. But beyond that, we're not just interested in critique. We believe that institutions play a valuable role in society. And we're interested in aiming to model the museum of the future. So one that champions bold action on climate change and provides its visitors with a more diverse range of stories and tools that they need to understand the rapidly changing world and shape it for the common good for generations to come. So why museums? Museums are popular culture. The museum sector is a $21 billion industry. It's larger than the video game industry and amusement park industries. In the United States alone, over 850 million people visit museums every year. That's nearly 3 times the entire population of the country. Museums see more visitors annually than sporting events and theme parks combined. They're a top 3 family destination, and they are among the most trusted sources of information. Science and natural history museums mediate our understandings of nature and environmental issues. They transmit information. They shape culture. They influence behavior. They normalize perspectives. And they form narratives. They train us what to see and how to see. There's currently an active and ongoing debate in the field about the future of museums. Are they shrines to the past? Are they hubs of engagement for the present? Are they shapers of the future? As the world begins to feel the catastrophic effects of climate change, do science and natural history museums face a new imperative to become change makers? Central to our engagement with museums is the question of whose stories are being told by these institutions, whose science or ways of knowing are being communicated, and how and why. So our work focuses on revitalizing the public mandate of science and natural history museums, which in some cases has been weakened by special interests and institutionally narrow definitions of how to investigate, explore, and document the natural world and humans' impact on it. One of the other reasons we're engaging in this is, speaking from my activist standpoint, is that for many decades there's been an anti-institutional ethos on the American left. But we believe that institutions represent resources and infrastructure at scale that could be powerfully deployed in service of a better future. And that institutions are not monolithic. There are many, many good people on the inside that are invested in making change. And so we believe that we need to recalibrate our relationship to institutions. They're worth fighting for. And thus, the Natural History Museum, this sort of pompous claim to the prototypical Natural History Museum, with the intention of occupying every natural history museum. Essentially, we started a museum in order to get inside the sector to try to transform it from within. We registered with the American Alliance of Museums, and then we got an invitation from some curators we knew at the Queen's Museum to produce our launch exhibition there to coincide with the People's Climate March in September of 2014. So this turned out 400,000 people on the streets calling for action on climate change and really elevating climate justice, which is looking at the social justice dimensions of the impacts of climate change and our response to climate change. So we got that invitation with just 2 or 3 months notice. We had to scramble and make it look like we existed. So that was our strategy, fake it till you make it. The first thing we did was invest in the material infrastructure of our museum. How do we look like a museum? Well, we had a grant, our first grant, to launch the project. So we thought if we never get a dime again, at least we'll have all this stuff. We'll have a large format printer. We'll have a bus that we wrapped to look like a natural history museum bus. I love this thing so much. It's an airport shuttle bus where the seats face each other. So it's been great for doing, 1, for traveling our exhibitions, but 2, for taking people in them to do quote-unquote toxic tours in communities that are hit hardest by environmental change or on the front lines of the climate crisis, doing field expeditions with scientists to environmental hotspots. We went to a retreat for grantees of the foundation that supported our work, and they were folks around the country that were working on climate justice initiatives. And we took a hike together to take a look at the mountaintop removal sites in Kentucky. And we didn't have our logo yet, but we smacked green hats on top of everybody's heads and took a picture and called it an expedition. So it was a lot of staged photos in the summer, as quickly as possible, so that when we launched in September, we looked like a real institution. We got this tent, more field excursions. Sure, we're doing science. Looks like science, doesn't it? This is with the community group Uprose. They're based in Sunset Park in Brooklyn on the waterfront. They were hit especially hard by Sandy, Hurricane Sandy, but have done amazing work. Very resilient community of Puerto Rican and Dominican people primarily. So here's a toxic tour with the director of the National Institute for Environmental Health Science in Uprose. We bought taxidermy. It's nothing I ever expected to buy. It was really fun with my 2.5-year-old at the time, 3-year-old, to open up the next shipment, and there was a skeleton or a stuffed badger. We did workshops, as well as photography. We went into what's the best way to look like a natural history museum if we have an exhibition coming up in 2 months? Well, we went and shot photos in 4 or 5 natural history museums across the eastern seaboard. And built light boxes and put the act of viewing on display. So we're interested in this, in looking at the gaze, in actively viewing our gaze and our interaction with these pristine displays of nature that exclude humans from it. Are you looking at a gorilla? Or is it a diorama of a gorilla? And if it's a diorama, were there choices that were made about what to include and what not to include? And was there a politics to those choices? These are the sorts of questions that we wanted to raise to train people to think and view critically, to consider context. We're in the Anthropocene. Man's fingerprint is indelibly inscribed in the geologic strata of the earth. And so we seek to bring the socio-political and cultural dimensions of our relationship to nature into the picture as well. As I mentioned, museums offer perspectives. Our museum's perspective on nature is that of a commons, not something to be chopped up and sold off to the highest bidder. So we consider threats to that commons. A big subject of study for us is what we call the fossil fuel ecosystem, which is comprised of a complex series of interrelated feedback loops encompassing energy, culture, the economy, politics, nature. And we look at museums as ecologies within that broader fossil fuel ecosystem. With the Natural History Museum, Not an Alternative is not trying to present climate change directly or nature as a whole. Instead, we approach our setting from the side, the anthropomorphic gaze. So through examinations of labor histories and social movements and public relations and the practices of science communication, we transfer our attention to the infrastructures supporting what we see and how we see within the fossil fuel ecosystem. So we had our grand opening at the Queen's Museum. That's the ribbon cutting ceremony. And we had invested in canvas and poles to build a sort of modular tent that could be reconfigured and repurposed for any size space, creating a museum inside a museum or doing it out in the field. We wrote an essay to correspond with the exhibit, exhibiting the gaze, that sort of excavated the history of natural history and science museums, as well as world's fairs and public relations and advertising practices of display, all very interrelated spheres in the early days. We curated programming. In large part, the exhibit was really just a stage set or a backdrop for what took place there. A series of discussions and workshops and tours with scientists and climate justice activists, and also looking at the trajectory of institutional critique, moving beyond institutional critique to institutional liberation. So for the art students in the room, perhaps you'll recognize Hans Haacke and Mark Dion, big figures in institutional critique. And, you know, we launched a provocation to this sector, calling on science and natural history museums to reevaluate their roles in a time of profound social and environmental change. But the response we got was, we can't. We're neutral. Museums, like scientists, have historically maintained a position of what museologist Robert Janes calls authoritative neutrality. We have to protect our neutrality lest we fall prey to bias, trendiness, or special interest groups. But as Janes points out, museums increasingly depend on private sector sponsorship. Their claims to neutrality thus start to take on an ideological bent. After all, what are corporations if not special interest groups? We teamed up with 150 of the world's top scientists, including several Nobel laureates, to release a letter calling on science and natural history museums to cut ties to fossil fuel interests. We invoked the American Alliance of Museums Code of Ethics, which states, "It's incumbent upon museums to be resources for humankind and in all their activities to foster an informed appreciation of the rich and diverse world we have inherited. It is also incumbent upon them to preserve that inheritance for posterity." So it's not enough just to educate and present inside the confines of the gallery walls our natural history. If we are to preserve and protect that for posterity, are we just talking about taxidermic specimens? Or are we talking about what's out there in the world that we all depend upon? The response was, well, there's a firewall between board members or sponsors and curation and programming. Yet, in talking to our board members, James Powell, the former director and president of the Los Angeles County Natural History Museum and president of the Franklin Institute of Science, he asserted, your donor or board member doesn't have to be at the table. If he's a multi-million-dollar donor and his politics are known, it's represented in the room, it affects the conversation. So there are very few smoking gun cases of censorship, but the threat of self-censorship is very real. And when a sponsor is known for his anti-science practices, that sponsor circumscribes the very horizon of what's possible, not through coercion, but through the invisible threat of withdrawal. So we launched a petition, which got 552,000 signatures within 6 weeks, calling on the American Museum of Natural History to drop David Koch from its board. And we issued an op-ed that ran in The Guardian and was shared more than 11,000 times in a week, which was several thousand more than Chris Rock's op-ed in The Guardian that week. So we beat pop culture. We were very psyched about that. And then we got this opportunity to exhibit at the American Alliance of Museums convention. It was kind of funny how that happened. We heard on short notice that this convention was happening and that it was the largest museum convention in the world that brings together 7,000 museum professionals. And so we called up the American Alliance of Museums and asked, is there any way, could we drive our bus and maybe park it outside? We'd shot this interview series with luminaries from various disciplines, including Naomi Klein and Robert Reich and Mark Ruffalo and Winona LaDuke and Vandana Shiva on the topic of what is the museum of the future. So we thought we could park our bus outside and set up a sort of screening tent as people were walking in or out. That's something they could do. They said, let us get back to you. And they were on site at a scouting visit in advance of the convention and called me and said, there's just really no good place for you to park your bus here. There's like a taxi stop and you could park behind, but nobody would see you. So the only thing we can think of is to put you on the convention floor in the exhibit hall. And I was like, oh, we couldn't afford that. And they're like, well, we're getting close to the wire and we've sold out our booths. We have room for you. Just come on down. Wow. So all of a sudden we went from driving our bus from New York to Atlanta to displaying inside the convention at a 90 by 10 foot space, which was about 5 times larger than the American Museum of Natural History and the Smithsonian and right next to them. So we brought our bus onto the floor and set up an exhibit and took the opportunity to remake installations from the American Museum of Natural History, but this time include previously excluded socio-political context, primarily about their board member, David Koch. Our Climate, Whose Politics. This is one diorama, and it actually is a riff on one that was in a 2009 climate change exhibition inside the American Museum of Natural History that we thought was really powerful to begin with when it was first there. It depicted a polar bear on top of an iceberg amidst the detritus of urban waste. already a sort of embedded political commentary there. So we thought that was great. Let's just take it one step further, and we'll include a Koch Industries pipeline. My favorite story about that convention was we just finished installing, and we were at the hotel bar. We met some people who did exhibit design and had drinks and made friends. And it turns out that they do the AMNH's traveling exhibits, and that they worked on and continue to install the climate change exhibition as it travels. And so we showed them a picture of our diorama we had just completed, and they said, yeah, that's ours. Wait a second. No, it's not. They pulled out their phone and showed where they had just installed it in Italy, and we put them side by side. This one, will the story of the 6th mass extinction ever include the role of its sponsors? This diorama depicts the American Museum of Natural History's Dinosaur Hall, which is named after David Koch, in this sort of dystopic future. The walls are crumbling, the Allosaurus skull is broken. That actually happened in shipping, and we're still trying to get it replaced. And a human skeleton contemplating it. The plexi in front of it allows the viewer to be reflected in the picture. This installation is a water fountain that's, its water source is these 2 containers. And you can see also the sort of cross-section of the earth under it with worms and so on. One of the containers started out with clean water and the other not. So the first container is water source from a water fountain inside New York's American Museum of Natural History. New York City's public drinking water is among the cleanest in the world. And Governor Cuomo had just passed a ban on fracking, so hopefully it'll remain so. This is water sourced from North Pole, Alaska, which was contaminated with chemicals leaked from an oil refinery owned by Koch Industries. So where institutions tell us, we're not complicit, that's not relevant to us, we show within the fossil fuel ecosystem that our systems are connected. Neutrality is a political category that obscures realities from view. And there's always a curatorial point of view. It's impossible to be neutral. In the history of science, in the history of museums, these disciplines have never been neutral. And historian Howard Zinn says that history is a moving train. It's heading in a direction. And simply by standing still, you are complicit in that direction. So neutrality doesn't serve us in the midst of the climate crisis. Our children are set to inherit a much more dangerous world than the one we grew up in. And every time I say that, I get choked up. We curated a screening on the Anthropocene, a series of films at the exhibit. And then from there, took this message to the Smithsonian in partnership with the Interfaith Moral Action on Climate, a group of faith leaders and institutions who called on the Smithsonian to cut ties to fossil fuel interests. A few months later, after a ton of press and attention, we won. Thank you. I'll say that in 20 years of doing activism, this was the most viral effort I had ever been a part of. And I think part of that is the contradiction of having a science denier in a leadership position at a science museum is so great. And certainly Koch was a lightning rod for controversy. So it felt like low-hanging fruit in terms of lobbing a provocation at the sector writ large. But we certainly did not expect to win. And we saw that our efforts were gaining traction and getting support from people outside and inside the sector. We teamed up with 350.org, which is an international organization that works on climate change and had been instrumental in launching the fossil fuel divestment movement, similar to the apartheid divestment movement, calling on institutions to pull out their financial holdings from fossil fuel companies. Probably the most rapidly growing social movement in human history. In just a few years, trillions of dollars pledged in divestments from municipalities and faith-based institutions and universities, but not cultural institutions yet. So we teamed up to call on 5 of our nation's leading science and natural history museums to demonstrate their leadership by divesting from fossil fuels. And within a few hours of announcing that campaign and pushing it on social media, the California Academy of Sciences stepped up to the plate. Their director posted a blog on their site saying that they were committing not only to divesting, but also implementing a gifts policy that would preclude them from taking fossil fuel funding in the future, and disentangling themselves from land titles and deeds that had oil and gas and mining deeds on them. And after that, in the course of about 6 months or so, 8 institutions followed suit by either dropping a sponsor or divesting or implementing gifts policies. And they did this with publicly with different reasons, different rationales. For many, it was about risk management, which either meant reputational risk management or financial risk management. Currently, divested portfolios outperform those that aren't. Or, as the Australian Academy of Sciences said, risk management from an Earth systems perspective. Fossil fuels are not a good long-term investment. When the consensus of the world's scientists is that we have to leave at least 40 to 60% of existing fossil fuel reserves in the ground if we're to avoid catastrophic runaway climate change. The business models of these institutions are fundamentally unsustainable. They're putting us on a crash course. So you can claim neutrality, but we're all on this train, and we're calling on our institutions to really interrogate their relevance in the midst of the climate crisis against this landscape. Other institutions said it was about mission alignment and that it was hard to reconcile the mission of an institution committed to sustainability and inspiring awe and educating people about nature with an investment in fossil fuels. So it wasn't just us. There were others around the world, artist collectives, BP or not, to BP or not BP was theater professionals who would get on stage before the Royal Shakespeare Company's performances as an intervention and say, "Out, damn logo, out," and do this Shakespearean performance. And got the Edinburgh Film Festival to cut ties to fossil fuel interests. There were others around the world, and we'd never had a face-to-face, but been inspired by one another's work. So last December, we raised funds to bring everyone together on the occasion of the UN Climate Summit in Paris to strategize and birth the fossil-free culture movement, or hashtag Museum Liberation Movement. Launched it with a performance at the Louvre that made headlines around the world. But, you know, as we sat back and really thought about our vision for success, is it that we want museums to drop sponsors, the end? Is it that we want museums to talk more about climate change, the end? The reality is that climate change shows up in different ways. That's how we're going to be experiencing it. The what did she call it? The anthropomorphic gaze, right, is looking at something from the side, and that's what climate change is. It's too large to tackle or touch. But it shows up as refugee camps and mass migration. It shows up as extreme weather events and water privatization. So for us, the problem is not whether or not our institutions are relevant, but also relevant to whom and to what end. We need museums not just to talk about climate change, but to think about, address, include the communities that are hit hardest by environmental change. And that's Flint, Michigan. That's Standing Rock, North Dakota. There are hundreds of Flints around the country on Native American reservations, right? There are people who are dying by the thousands on boats on our oceans, trying to find a better life because their countries are changing. The Natural History Museum enacts a version of what Don Hughes, vice president of the exhibitions at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, has called moral propaganda. It seeks to, quote, design space and to present content that moves people in a specific social or political direction. So museums matter, but not just as content providers. As collective institutions, they can play a powerful role, not only in educating the public about the unpredictable and overlapping effects of climate change on the Earth's ecological and social systems, but also in advocating for an equitable, sustainable, and just future. Thinking about that, our next project was to team up with Tejas, a Latino community in an environmental justice organization in East Houston, where the city of Houston is the largest city in the country that has no zoning regulations whatsoever. It also is home to the second largest petrochemical hub on the planet. So there are communities, low-income communities of color, whose homes literally kiss chemical tanks in the shadow of refineries. So we wanted to bring attention to what they were dealing with and think about how to make science and natural history more relevant to the day-to-day lives of these communities. Right? So this is our most recent exhibition this spring. And I'm getting fuzz. Try that again. There it is. Try one more time. It's not playing. I could close out of this and open it on my desktop. Should I do that? Yeah? Okay, great. Thanks for your patience. So, okay, I'll tell you a little bit about what we did in Houston. We went on a scouting visit and visited the Houston Museum of Natural Science, which is really sponsored by a who's who of fossil fuel companies. And so we were interested in what are the stories and narratives and displays in the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences, particularly around energy, and what's missing. So that's what our exhibition was about.
Is the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences a museum or a PR front for the
Uh-oh. Thank you. Woo! Okay. And now let's see if I can just...
fuel industry? That's the central question of mining the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences, an investigation by the Natural History Museum. This is our exhibition. We're a mobile and pop-up natural history museum that looks at the fossil fuel ecosystem, including museums of science and natural history that mediate our understandings of fossil fuels, energy, and the environment. Here we are in the belly of the beast, one of the world's largest petrochemical hubs, where the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences is sponsored by a who's who of oil and gas companies, many of them headquartered here in Houston. So in this exhibition, we're taking a look at some of the installations and dioramas inside the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences. So for instance, this diorama is a replica of one found in the museum's Texas Coastal Ecology Wing. It's an almost exact replica. In fact, the photographic backdrop is a photograph of the Houston Museum's diorama, but we included a little bit more, almost as if we sort of stepped back from the frame to get a broader shot, taking a look at what they include and also what isn't found inside the museum. What's missing is any of these socio-political, socio-cultural, economic impacts of fossil fuel exploration and extraction. In the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences, there's a sponsorship wall where the size of the name corresponds to the size of the contribution. The more money they give, the larger their name is on the wall. On ours, the larger their CO2 or carbon emissions, the larger the name. One of the sponsorship perks to donors that contribute $25,000 or more to the museum is that their employees get priority training scheduling to become volunteer docents of the museum's energy hall. So here is an ExxonMobil employee who is a volunteer docent giving tours of the Weiss Energy Hall to school kids and field trips. The song that you hear playing here is one that plays in a cartoon video in the Energy Hall. It's oil, it makes the modern world go round. It's oil, a hidden treasure deep underground. Many kids come to visit the museum and take these guided tours on field trips. Also, local area kids, if they grow up within 2 miles of the Houston Ship Channel where industry is concentrated, have a 56% greater likelihood of getting childhood leukemia than kids who grow up elsewhere. This is Operation Dinosaur. We're teaming up with Tejas, a local environmental justice group, to put out dozens of these dinosaurs with air quality monitoring badges. These are the same that workers wear inside refineries and chemical plants to monitor what's in the air that they're breathing. We're recreating the conditions of a study conducted in 2005 by the Houston Chronicle, where they put up dozens of these badges in the fence line communities in the east end of Houston. So now, a little more than 10 years later, we're asking those same questions, trying to generate data to understand what's in the air that people are breathing.
These are things that are usually used for workers, and they wear them while they're working on site at the facility for 24 hours or whatever period they're looking at. And that tells the company whether the worker is being exposed to unsafe levels. So these were designed to be right there on the site. And what the study of Houston Chronicle's research showed was that these levels were unsafe in neighborhoods, you know, away from the sites, away from the properties and facilities.
Tejas does a lot of toxic tours, and we're teaming up with them to host monthly toxic tours during the exhibition. We've created this map for Tejas's toxic tours, And it tells you where the refineries are, schools, residential areas, petrochemical plants, metal recycling facilities, diesel trucks and highway traffic, ship transport. And wherever you see a dinosaur figurine, that's where we're going to be placing our air quality monitoring badges over the next few months. For our final installation, we have a couple hologram videos in here inside miniature dioramas. Here is a mini diorama of Manchester in Houston's East End with members of Tejas giving one of their toxic tours.
There are times that we even have leaks and explosions that we hear and sirens that go off. And sometimes we have derailments in the communities. And luckily, we haven't had anything explode.
And this one is inside the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences. You'll see the Natural History Museum's museum anthropologist offering a tour of the ways in which the Houston Museum trains its visitors to take the perspective of the energy industry.
That's it for our tour today, kids. Hopefully, you've gained some skills in learning how to see, what to see, and what remains excluded from our seeing. Until next time, museum anthropologists.
So that was our Houston exhibition. We were surprised to see the Houston Chronicle ended up editorializing. They wrote an op-ed about the exhibition that leaded with the exhibition and said that, you know, our critique had merit, and the whole rest of the column was dedicated to calling on the mayor and industry to regulate and be more concerned about environmental justice issues. So that felt good. It felt impactful. We put up different billboards. Here's one of them around the city of Houston. So that was our Operation Dinosaur. But after that, we felt like we'd been going a mile a minute for about a year and a half, and really the project went farther and faster than we could have imagined. 552,000 petition signatures, 8 institutions that cut ties to fossil fuel interests, built our email list to 100,000 people from scratch, 150 top scientists in our network. We were named one of 3 trending topics in the Center for the Future of Museums annual publication, profiled in museum life and different museum blogs, and integrated into curricula and museum studies programs. So it felt like we needed to hit pause and reflect on what had just happened and really think about next steps and how we could be impactful, and really struggled for a long time with our positionality. Are we outside the sector, shaking a fist, doing exhibitions like the Houston one that really sought to augment the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences displays with excluded information, but really was very easily read as it was, as a jab at the Houston Museum? How much would that toxify us or undermine efforts to work collaboratively with museums? Because change happens in many ways, but it can't just happen from the outside. We have to mobilize and collaborate with champions on the inside of the institution. We'd met so many of them. So we decided to stop and engage in a research phase for the last 5-6 months of this year. And we went to every museum conference we possibly could. The Association of Science and Technology Centers and the American Alliance of Museums. At our booth, we talked to so many people coming in and out, interviewed them, asked questions, went to panels, presented on panels. I joined the Association of Science Museum Directors, which is where I met Amy. That's funny, I was just Googling around one day doing our research, and found it online, and all you had to do was fill out a form and send in a $50 check, and you were a member. So I figured I would do that, and that qualified me to go to the annual retreat, which was in Vancouver this year. So I posted on Facebook. I was laughing thinking that Amy would be in the audience when I said this, but I've been working at a co-working space out of our studio for the last 10 years. My museum director wardrobe was pretty anemic. So I posted on Facebook and asked, does anybody have any clothes and jewelry that would make me look wealthy and professional? And went and raided friends' closets. That when I tell that story now, my museum director friends say, we're not wealthy. So that was a really great opportunity to just learn more, start asking questions, better understand what decision makers in these institutions are dealing with. What are their aspirations for their institutions? Where do they draw the line? How can we be helpful? Getting feedback from some that, your provocations gave us space to push farther and get farther than we could have without that. But going from our first year of provocation, we're pivoting to think about collaboration. In a strategy we're calling splitting the sector. So thinking about, okay, there's some museums that are just in political climates where they really can't take a stand. But there are others that are ready and willing to do this. We've already seen indication of that, right? And we can work with them to create new content case studies, right? And if we push it too far, that's okay, because there's others, right? They're popping up from all over the place, right? So our first experiment with this was, rather than targeting museums with a petition or a letter, we worked with museums just a couple weeks ago to create a sign-on letter after the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, which has been fighting to stop construction on the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota. It's a pipeline that would stretch across many states, but the company applied for the pipeline in segments so that it could bypass the national requirement around a full and thorough environmental impact statement, and instead did these little mini environmental assessments, which did not include meaningful consultation with the tribe. The pipe's route, because people in Bismarck made a stink about it, got redirected to go just a half mile from the reservation and cross the Cannonball and the Missouri River, which supplies water to 8,000 tribal members and 17 million more people, right? And so their opposition and resistance to this pipeline grew, right? They set up an encampment, and now, to date, more than 300 tribes, unprecedented, First Nations from Canada and throughout the United States and even Mexico, up to 5,000 people at a time staying at this encampment and making international headlines. The tribal archaeologist and historic preservation officer had just been invited by a private landowner whose land was taken by eminent domain for the pipeline to go through. He was sure that his land had Native American burial grounds and sacred sites on it. So he invited the archaeologist from the tribe, historic preservation officer, to come do a walkthrough. And sure enough, they noticed grave markers, stone cairns that signify a site of ritual. They took documentation and updated court documents with the precise GPS coordinates. And less than 24 hours after publicly disclosing them, the Dakota Access Pipeline Company redirected their bulldozers from 25 miles away to that precise location and bulldozed it. Flanked by private security firm that had attack dogs that bit 8 peaceful, nonviolent protectors. They call themselves water protectors, not protesters, including a pregnant woman and a child. Pepper sprayed 30 people. And this was all, news cameras were there. It was all on film. And so we thought this was an opportunity for museums and scientists, archaeologists, anthropologists, to demonstrate leadership within their areas of expertise by publicly denouncing the destruction of these sacred sites of cultural heritage. And within 5 days, we got 1,500 signatures, 50 from museum directors and other institutions. These are institutions that normally don't do advocacy, don't take positions, right? So by all accounts, from what we've heard from people in the sector, this was the most rapid and swift response they'd ever gotten. And then moving forward, we're planning content collaborations with institutions to develop content that will make them more relevant to the communities they hope to serve and to the communities that are on the front lines of a changing climate. So I invite anyone who's interested to join us in this effort. Just go to thenaturalhistorymuseum.org or write us at info@thenaturalhistorymuseum. We believe that our cultural institutions, as place-based institutions, create community and can create change in the world. Thank you.